Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jody Patterson, Client Care Manager for Oasis Solutions. Thank you for joining the webinar this afternoon for Tips and Tricks Purchase Order Module. Presenting today is going to be Pam Scott, our Director of Client Services. I see quite a few familiar names and email addresses that have joined today. Thank you for coming back to join us in the continuation of the Tips and Tricks series that we do every month with Pam Scott. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar today, but we do want you to ask questions, so please enter those into the Q&A window. You will find that located in the center of the Zoom control bar at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer questions live as we go along, but if we run out of time, we will follow up with you offline to answer any questions that we weren't able to address during the webinar. Also, we want to please ask you to complete the survey that you will receive at the end of the webinar. We encourage you to let us know how we did. We appreciate all the feedback, and also feel free to suggest topics that you would like us to cover in future webinars. Your input does help us make this webinar series more useful to the customers. So now let's go ahead and get started. Pam Scott, I will turn control over.
Thank you, Jody. I appreciate it. Everyone should be able to see my screen. We're working today in Sage 100 in the 2020 version. So as we start today with purchase order, the first thing that I want to review with you is we're going to go into the setups and we're going to look at the purchase order options. And just a couple of things that I wanted to point out that are in the options is under the main tab. This first question is the number of days to retain completed purchase orders. And you'll notice that in my demo data, it's set to 0. And I probably want to keep my history longer than 0 days. How this information is purged out is that when you do a period in processing within the PO module, Sage comes out and takes a look at this setting and to determine how many days you're wanting to complete, or excuse me, to keep those completed POs in your history. And at that point, whatever this is set at, it will then purge that information from your Sage. So that number is tied to your period in processing, and you do want to make sure that this is set to an adequate number of days. The next thing that you have the ability to do is to automatically close partially received purchase orders. And clients that I see that have a need to do this is maybe they're ordering things by the gallon or the pound, and maybe you're ordering a tanker of a chemical, and you know that it may be 3,000 pounds that you're getting, but you may get less than that or a little bit more than that. So this will allow you to automatically consider a PO received, fully received, if this is checked, and then you put in what the acceptable variance is. So you may not have a need for that, but if your business does have variations, you do have the ability to set this setting. Also, and most of you know that the purchase order module does tie to the accounts payable module, and this next question is asking if you want to post account payable invoices. And what that is referring to is, do you want the functionality to be able to do the receipt of invoice within the PO module? Over on the right, it has integrate with, and this shows the various modules that you can integrate with, integrate PO with. If you'll notice on my particular screen, job cost and work order is grayed out. That's because in my demo company, ABC, those two modules are not activated and in use. But if you do use the job cost module or the work order module, then you certainly can integrate those with your purchase order. And now we're going to go to the Generate tab. And I wanted to show you on the Generate tab, something that was added a couple of versions ago is the ability to combine sales orders by vendor. So if you're generating your POs based on your sales orders, you now have the ability, instead of it being one PO per sales order, if it's the same vendor, you can have it combine multiple sales orders onto one PO. So I did want to show you that functionality. And then we're going to flip over here to the History tab. And this is going to be asking you what type of history you want to maintain. And I firmly believe that if you can retain history, you should. You need to keep it for an adequate amount of time, because the system has the ability to purge information if you decide you're keeping too much history. So the first thing that it's asking you is if you just in general want to retain your PO history. And then if you're retaining it, it's going to ask you if you want to retain deleted orders. And you have the option of yes, no, or prompt. And you also have the option for retaining deleted lines on an order, and your options are yes, no, or prompt. So the definition of those items on the drop-down is if you say yes, then it is going to retain deleted orders in your PO history. And if you're looking at your PO history or doing an inquiry, you're actually going to see that deleted order listed on your list of POs. If you say no, then it's not going to retain it in history. And then if you say prompt, when you go to delete that order, it's actually going to prompt you for a reason code of why you're deleting that order. And I'll show you in just a minute where those reason codes are maintained. And then the same definitions apply to whether or not you want to retain the deleted lines in an order. That you can say yes, no, or prompt. You have the number of years to retain your purchase history by item and vendor. The minimum is 2 years, and then you can take it all the way up to 99 years. And then also you can talk about whether you want to retain your receipt history. And you can say yes, no, summary only, or until period end, meaning it will retain receipt history. Once you do your period in processing, it purges it out, and then just the current period history would be there. I believe, my opinion is that you do want to just say yes and retain that receipt history. I can't tell you the number of times that we go back and look at that receipt history when we're troubleshooting PO questions or issues for clients. They're wanting to know why something happened, or why it appears that the PO is still open or it's not open and it's been completed but they don't think it should be. And we go back and we look at that history so we can see exactly what's happened. So again, it's up to you how you want to retain that history, but I do want to make you aware of what is there. It's probably better to set the history to store it, to keep it longer than you want, because if you have it set very low and you do a period in processing, it's going to purge that information out. So you can't basically unpurge that information. So that takes us through a few things in the options that I wanted to show you today. And talking about those reason codes, in the purchase order module under setup, you have something called cancel and reason code maintenance. And you can go in and define any amount of reason codes that you want. So here's just a couple that are set up. You found a better price with a different vendor, so you're going to cancel that PO. Maybe your customer canceled their order, so you don't need to order it from your vendor. The vendor doesn't have enough quantity on hand to fill, and so forth. But it's very easy to add a new item. So let's say that you're having to cancel the order because of COVID and you don't need to stock that item at this time, you can give it you just basically type in a code and go over to the description, and you only have so many characters in this field. So if you see, I can type 19, but then once I get over to about right here, I have no more characters. So I can add that item and click accept, and then it's actually going to save that. The other thing that you'll notice is it has a column for inactive. So if a code is no longer applicable, so let's say that this COVID code is no longer applicable, hopefully in a few months, then you can just click and check that that's inactive. And basically, when you're trying to then cancel that PO or whatever, it's going to come up and ask you for the code, and there will be a drop-down box that will list everything that's here. And then you can pick that code. If I make something inactive, then obviously it's not going to show up on the list for selection. So those are a couple of the things that I just wanted to show you related to the setup. Jody, I'll just ask real quickly if anyone had any questions related to what we looked at in the setup.
No questions so far.
Okay, thank you. A couple of things I want to make you aware of is that in purchase order, you have an auto reorder selection. And basically what that does, if you go into the auto reorder selection, it is going to go out and it's going to look at your inventory reorder levels. So if this is related to inventory items, and if you use mins and maxes in your inventory and you use reorder levels, you can go in and do an auto reorder selection. Obviously that that item would have to have a vendor associated with it. But you can tell it, you can basically go into this area, click proceed, and Sage is going to go out and look at your inventory items. They're going to look at the quantity available, and they're going to look to see if it's below the reorder point. And if it meets that criteria, then it will automatically create a PO for you so that you don't have to do it on your own. But one thing I do want to make a note of is that, you know, starting a couple of versions back, you could start making inventory items inactive. This reorder selection does not take that into consideration. So if an item is inactive, it's still going to pull that information. So it's not going to really take that into consideration. So you might want to be aware of that if you're using this reorder selection. The other thing that you can do is you can auto-generate from sales orders. And this is really good for individuals that maybe truly do not keep inventory in a warehouse. Or you don't keep stock in your warehouse. You only basically order something from your vendor when you get an order from your client. So you can actually have it go through and auto-generate purchase orders based upon your new sales orders. So you would walk through this process. There's a lot of things here to take a look at as far as what you want to generate. But basically, once you have your selection criteria, once you have your selection criteria, you can go down and click proceed, and anything that falls within this default, it will go out there and recommend the POs that it should create for you. So that is also another way to automatically generate POs versus doing a manual purchase order entry. So just be aware that those two exist. I think someone may have a question, Jody, if you want to communicate with them.
I don't see any questions. I do see a hand raised. Sharon. Oh, okay. So the question is, what did you just say? About auto-generate the purchase orders from the sales orders.
Okay, so you have the ability to, instead of doing a manual purchase order entry, if you do sales order entry, you have the ability to generate a PO directly from a sales order. And if you want to do that feature, you're going to click on the auto generate sales order, or from sales order, pardon me. You're going to go through all of the selection criteria, determine how you want, you know, what you want selected, what you do not want selected, and then you're basically going to click proceed. And at that point, it will give you the recommended POs that it would suggest that you generate. So you do not have to use this functionality. Quite honestly, most of our clients probably do not use it because there are too many different criteria, and they basically want to go in and do the plain or the basic purchase order entry.
And I think that answered the question. I also wanted to mention that a lot of our customers will often generate the purchase order off of the sales order, but off of the sales order directly. So when you're on the sales order, do you cover that today, Pam?
No, we do not.
So maybe that would
that's
be
a good
future tips and tricks on sales
right,
order.
Yeah, that was, yeah, right. That wasn't something I was going to show today, but that is a good point. Oh, sorry. Okay, anything else?
There is another question, but I don't understand the question. Sharon, if you can clarify that last question.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to the next area, and then we can come back to her question. I'll be glad to do that. So the next thing we're going to talk about is just purchase order entry and the various things that you can do within purchase order entry. So when you go into the purchase order entry, you can assign it its own number, or you can have Sage assign the next number in order by clicking on the pound sign, which is what I'm going to do. The order date is going to default to your system date, but you can change that if you need to. And then what we want to take a look at is the order type defaults to standard order. But if you do a drill down, you're going to be able to see the various types of orders that you can generate from within the PO module. You can do a drop ship, and we're going to talk a little bit more about drop ships shortly and kind of what you want to, some things you want to be aware of. You can do master orders. You can do repeating orders, and in just a few minutes, we're going to talk about the difference between those two. And you also can do a material requisition. And a material requisition is more of an internal request for something out of your inventory. So if your company maybe has like a central supply and your office supplies get charged back to your department, and you have to actually, you know, request that you need 3 reams of paper and a package of paper clips, you could use the material requisition feature so that you can make that request to take things out of inventory, and then it can get charged back to your department. So, and we'll talk about that as well. So what I want to talk about first is a drop ship order. And if you do drop ships, the main thing that you need to remember is, and this is critical if you have inventory. Now, if you're using miscellaneous item codes or miscellaneous charge codes, and it's not physically, you're not physically bringing things into a warehouse, it's not critical. But if you do have inventory, when you tell Sage that the order type is a drop ship, it assumes that you are never going to receive that into your inventory, because it is, you know, it's just not going to come in through inventory because it's a drop ship. You're having it shipped somewhere else. On the opposite side of that, when you do a purchase, or excuse me, a sales order, you can also make a sales order drop ship. If your sales order is a drop ship, then your purchase order also should be a drop ship. because you want nothing coming into or going out of your inventory. And I know that sounds a little confusing, but in Sage's terminology, if something is considered drop ship, it's never going to hit your inventory. So if you made a purchase order, a standard PO, but your sales order was a drop ship, what would happen is you issue the standard PO for the item, it comes in, you do a receipt of goods, and it goes into your inventory. When you invoice your customer out of sales order, you have said that that sales order is a drop ship, so it is not going to come out of your inventory. So you have to be consistent if you're using the sales order module. You have to be consistent with drop ships, that it's a drop ship on the sales order side and on the purchase order side. So a lot of people get kind of messed up with that, and they can't figure out why things maybe haven't come out of their inventory and so forth. So, and by the same token, if you did a standard PO, but a standard sales order, but the purchase order was a drop ship, you're not going to receive those goods in for them to be sold. So hopefully that wasn't confusing, but you do want to make sure that you understand the definition of both of those. Now what we're going to talk about is a master order versus a repeating order. And a master order, sometimes I'll hear people call them like a blanket order. So a master order is when you're possibly wanting to order a large quantity of item, but you're going to order that over a period of time. So I've contacted my vendor and I said, you know, between now and the end of 2021, I know that I'm going to order 20,000 widgets from you. You know, what kind of price can you give me if I place that order between now and the end of 2021? So when they give me that information, I can create a master order for the total blanket order, and then I issue a PO against the master order when I'm ready to receive some of the merchandise. So I'm going to show you a master order that I have set up. So you'll notice that this says that it's a master order. And when I go into the lines tab, I tell it how many that I'm planning on ordering. So again, if it was going to be 20,000, I would put in the item code for my widgets, and I would put in a quantity of 20,000 and the unit cost that they're quoting me. This balance field is going to be blank. So I have these items on my master order, and when I am ready to order more of this item, and this is a desk, and I have 5 on my original order. If I'm ready to basically order 2 more of these, and I want to go ahead and order 2 more of the paper caddies as well, once I have my master order in, I'm going to go and do a regular purchase order entry. I'm going to say that the type is standard. And then in the field to the right, it says master or repeating order. So if this is going to pull from a master order, I'm going to go in and I'm going to look up that master order and grab it. Then when I go to my lines tab, it is basically going to pull in everything that was on my master order, and it's actually pulling in the quantity that I had left because I had already issued a PO against that master order. So if this time I want to order 2 of these on each one, I'm going to change the quantity ordered, and I'm going to accept it. And if I go back and I look at my master order and go to my lines, you're going to see that it's reducing the balance. So I had already issued a PO for 1 of each of these, and a moment ago it said the balance was 4. I just put 2 more on a PO, and now it's reduced the balance left on my master order to 2. if I go to my totals tab, I can actually see the last time that I issued a PO against it. Now, it doesn't give me the list of every PO I've issued against it, but I can see that in the purchase order history. So I am able to look at all of the POs that would be issued against that master order. So again, that's what is considered a master order. A repeating order, how that might be different is, let's say that, you know, I don't think that I'm going to order a total quantity of items over the next year, but I know on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, whatever the situation is, I'm going to order a certain number of items from this vendor on a consistent basis. So this is a repeating order that I set up. And if you go to the Lines tab, I put in the items that I want and how many that I'm planning on ordering each time I issue a PO against this repeating order. So you have the quantities listed here. When I'm ready to issue a PO against this repeating order, what I'm going to do is I'm going to issue a new PO number. I'm going to reference the repeating order. I'm going to go to my Lines tab and see it automatically populated the amount that I had from my repeating order. So you may be asking yourself, well, what if this month I just don't need as many as is on the repeating order? That's fine. You don't have to modify the repeating order, the standard order that I'm issuing against it. You can actually go in and change those quantities, and it's not a problem. You can also add an item. Maybe there's an item that you do need from this vendor, but it just, it's not related to the repeating order. I can go in and I can add an item to this list as well. And this item will not pull over to my repeating order. It's just adding it to the standard order. And I'm going to accept it. And now if I go back and look at my original repeating order, you can also see the last purchase order against it as well. So Jody, are there any questions about those two?
No new questions, but there is a leftover question from regarding generating the sales purchase orders off of sales orders. Clarifying the question is, you said that the sales orders would then automatically recommend a purchase order based on the criteria. Can you clarify what that means? Does it recommend the purchase order items?
The auto-generate sales order, the criteria that I'm talking about is answering all of these questions. So you're basically selecting a lot of the criteria, which, you know, there's too many variables to talk about today, but this is where you're going to go in and select the appropriate boxes of what you want the criteria for it to go out and look at on a sales order before it generates a purchase order. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. If it doesn't, what we probably need to do is follow up with her after the session and maybe get some more specifics. But
Okay.
This is the criteria that I'm referring to, and then also your boxes down here where you can go through and select if it's just for a specific purchase order number, or if it's all POs. But this is the entire criteria that you have to go through to determine what you want to generate. So hopefully that helps some.
Let us know if that answered the question. If not, we'll follow up with you offline.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Thank you. So just kind of going back to that purchase order entry to see if anybody does have additional questions about a master order versus a repeating order. We talked about a material requisition, and I just want to show you very briefly what that looks like and how the screen is a little bit different. So if I tell it this is a material requisition, watch my screen. So you'll notice that it removes all the vendor information, and then you can list who requested it and what department. And then when you go to the Lines tab, then you can still fill in those items. And again, this could be inventory items. It can also be miscellaneous items that you're wanting to track. So if you have a central supply, that would be a good example of where it might be used. You know, maybe your sales department, maybe you keep an inventory of samples that they're allowed to hand out to customers, and you want to track where those are going and to which salespeople. This is something that you could do with that material requisition. As I mentioned, you can kind of charge it back to a department. You don't have to, but at least it does give you an idea of where those items are going if they're coming out of your inventory. And I'm not sure if anyone on here uses job cost. But if you are using job cost, let me change to my job cost company. So this company is integrated with job cost. If you're doing purchase order, a purchase order entry, it opens this field up where you can assign a job number to it. So if you're wanting to, you know, expense those goods to a job, then you can do this for inventory items. You can also do it for miscellaneous items where you can have that go to a job number. So I had a question come up prior to, actually to this webinar, asking about job cost. So you have to make sure that your PO module is integrated with job cost. And then as you're doing your PO for, again, for inventory items or miscellaneous items that are not tracked in inventory, you can assign those to a job. And if you're issuing a PO and it's not job cost related, then you're basically going to leave that blank. So I did want to cover that because I knew that someone was probably going to pose that question today. Okay. All right. So we've talked about you know, the purchase order entry, and when your merchandise comes in, you basically are going to do one and or two processes. You're going to do a receipt of goods when the merchandise comes in, or you're going to do a receipt of invoice. These can be two separate functions, or with receipt of invoice, you can also combine it with the, with the receipt of goods, you can also combine it with the receipt of invoice. So if you receive the goods and the invoice at the same time, I know normally that doesn't happen, but if it does happen, when you do the receipt of goods, and I'm going to just pull up PO, you have this option to put in an invoice number. If I leave this blank and I continue through my process, it is only going to do the receipt of goods and put those items into my inventory if they're inventory items. Also, you're going to do the receipt if it's a miscellaneous item, but nothing is going to hit AP. And this is going to be if you leave that blank. If you leave that blank, when you do get the invoice, you're going to go into the receipt of invoice, and you're going to pull up that PO. Whoops. And then this is where you're going to key in the invoice number. So it can be two separate entries, or you can do all of it within the receipt of goods. Cancel. In talking about the receipt of goods and the receipt of invoice, in just a few minutes, we're going to talk about purchases clearing and how that works. But in Sage terms, unless you have that feature turned on earlier that we looked at that talked about where you could close a partially received purchase order, unless that is checked and set up, a PO is not considered complete within Sage until it has been fully received and fully invoiced. So if you order 10 and you receive 10, but you only enter invoices in for a quantity of 9, it is not going to consider that PO completed because it still thinks there's one out there to be invoiced. Now, we'll talk about in a minute that there's reasons why maybe you're not going to get invoiced for that one, and you're going to need to kind of close out that PO. But I just want you to be aware that in order for Sage to consider it complete and closed, it has to be fully received and fully invoiced. So does anybody have any questions about that?
No questions.
Okay. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to go in under period end. And we're going to look at the purchases clearing report. A lot of times we'll get questions from clients about wanting to know, you know, we have all of these old POs in our system and we can't figure out why they're still there. There can be various reasons, but a lot of times it's literally what we just discussed, that it hasn't been fully received or invoiced. So if you go to your purchases clearing report, and I'm just gonna put this, just put in some basic criteria and preview it. This is going to show me all of my open POs, and it's basically going to show me why they are open. Now I have a couple here that just haven't gone through the closing process. But if you'll look at this item here, the second item, I ordered 66 of these. I've received 50, and there have been no invoices issued against this quantity. So that's the reason why this purchase order is still open. And it gives the total over here for purchases clearing. Your purchases clearing account is basic. It's set up in your PO options, and it's basically just a wash account. So when you do a receipt of goods, that entry hits your inventory, and then the offset of that goes to purchases clearing. When you do your receipt of invoice, then it comes out of your purchases clearing and hits your AP. So that's basically kind of how that account washes out. So you're going to be taking a look at your purchases clearing total and trying to determine why are these POs still open. We're going to talk about, they've really improved the utilities over the past few years on purging out old POs. But one thing you want to keep in mind, when you're purging out any history, any old POs, things that, you know, should have been cleaned up 10 years ago that are hanging out there, it will clean out those purchase orders, but it does not make any type of a journal entry. So it is not going to offset your purchases clearing account, and you would have to do that via a journal entry. So just be aware that when you're using any utilities or purging, that it is not going to in any way affect your general ledger. So, you know, if you're active with your PO module, you're probably always going to have dollars sitting out there in your purchases clearing, but it is a wash account. So it should, you know, what comes in should also be going out. But if you're trying to figure out why something is open, the first thing that I would do is I would go in and I would look at that purchases clearing report and try to determine why those POs are out there. So then in cleaning those up, we're going to go to the utilities in the purchase order module. And you'll notice that a whole lot of these have the word purge. There's a couple of things that I want you to remember if you don't remember anything else from today. Number one, before you ever do a purge utility, you want to make sure you have a good backup. And if I'm doing it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm going to want to back up from 2:59. I'm not going to want one from last night or last week, should I accidentally purge history that I didn't intend to. So always make sure you have a good backup. Once you purge, you can't unpurge. You do have to restore. The other thing is these purge utilities, who has access to them is mandated by their role maintenance and what they have rights to do. You do not want every person that has rights to get into the purchase order module to be able to go out here and do these purge features, because they may go in accidentally, not realize what they're doing or what the feature does, and accidentally purge out some of your history that you wanted to keep. So you might want to go in and check and see who has rights to do these purges and limit that. You know, maybe limit it to just the purchasing manager or your accounting manager and your purchasing manager, but just be careful with that. So when you go in to do a purge, and all of these have a little bit different screen, but we're going to go in and just say Purge Completed POs. It's going to say remove purchase orders completed on or before, and it says 0 days prior to a date. That 0 days is literally pulling from my purchase order options. If you remember, we took a look at that earlier. Whoops, right, days to retain completed POs. So if I want to keep them for a year, I click accept, and I go back and pull this up. Excuse me. You'll notice there that it says before 365 days. So if you have really old things out there, you might change that to, you know, 999 days and do some purging from a certain date and do it in increments. I would not try to purge 10 or 15 years worth of history at once. Number one, you don't know how long that's going to take. Number two, it's going to tie up your system. So kind of do it incrementally is how I prefer to do it. You know, I like to purge out, you know, maybe I'm going to purge out a certain year. And then after I purge that out, I'm going to go in, I'm going to take a look at my history, I'm going to look at my purchases clearing, and make sure that it appears that everything happened the way that I wanted it to before I move on and do another purge. If for whatever reason it didn't go well, then at that point is when I'm going to be stopping, I'm going to be restoring, and then try to figure out what I did incorrectly in my selection. So each of these you would have to go in and basically take a look at the selection criteria. For removing expired and repeating purchase orders, you can say whether you just want to do master, you want to do repeating, or you want to do both. And then it'll ask you the orders expired on date or before. So it's going to look at that date. And basically, if I'm making this selection, it's going to say, okay, if it expired on or before June 17th, I'm going to purge those out of the system. So again, just be really careful with that and make sure that you're keeping the history as long as you want to. Do we have any questions, Jody, so far?
No questions.
Okay, all right. So since we have a few more minutes, one of the things that I wanted to show you is within purchase order, you have an inquiry section. And you can do a vendor inquiry from within the PO module. You don't have to move to the AP module if you're working in purchase order. It's the exact same feature. Also, you can do an item inquiry. So instead of having to leave the purchase order module and go to the inventory module and do an item inquiry, you can also do it directly from the PO menu. The receipt history inquiry, I mentioned to you earlier that this is something that we do look at when we're troubleshooting. So if I go into, oops, sorry. So if I go into the receipt history, if I go in and pull up a PO number, and let me see if I can find one that has some history, then I can take a look at any of the history by using the Next tab. So here's the receipt number for this purchase order. You can see that I did a receipt of goods. If it says G, it's receipt of goods. If it says I, it's a receipt of invoice. It shows me the receipt date. Then I can go to lines and see exactly what was received on this PO. If there's more than one receipt, if I go to my Next button, you'll notice I have the same PO number. This receipt number starts with an I. So here's where I did the receipt of invoice. Here's my invoice number and my invoice date. And if I go to lines, there's nothing there because you're not receiving goods, it's an invoice. If I go to the next one, you'll notice this has an R. This is related to a return of goods. And that's something that we probably should talk about for just a second as well, is that return of goods feature. So again, if you want to see what has happened with a purchase order, you can do the receipt inquiry and see all of that information. There's also a receipt history report. So you can actually run a report on a PO by PO basis or all of your POs to see that history. So I can look at my purchase order, or excuse me, I can look at my receipt history. I can look at my PO history. And then here I have a PO history inquiry. So that's a general inquiry. And Jody, I think a question popped up a minute ago.
Yes, we do have a question. We require a deposit on the sales order before a purchase order can be issued. Is there any way to prevent a PO from being issued while a sales order is on money hold?
I do not know the answer to that off the top of my head. So I think if I understand the question, they do not want a purchase order issued until they've received that deposit.
On the sales order.
You can put sales orders on hold. I'll have to look and see if putting one on hold would prevent a PO from being issued. If you will get that person's name and email address, Jody, I will double check that and I will follow up with them after the presentation.
Got it. Thank you.
So yeah, I know internally for Oasis, we will issue, we'll have the sales order and have it on hold. And then we just basically know that when we get the money in, we go in and take it off hold. And we just have an internal process, but I will see what is, if there's a way to know that for sure just through the system. Talking about real quickly, and then we'll see if there's any more questions before we finish up, a return of goods. So if you, let's say that you order 10 widgets and you receive 10 widgets, and when you've received those, after you receive them and update your inventory, you realize that 2 of them are broken. And you need to return them to your vendor for replacement. You can do a return of goods, and you basically give it a return number. You're going to reference the original PO number. And I'm going to just grab one here that hopefully will work. If you already have an invoice number associated with it, you can also put that in so that it takes that two of those basically off of the original invoice. If your vendor gives you an RMA number, you can type that number in here as well, in this field that I'm pointing to. And then you're going to go to the Lines tab, and it's asking me, do I want to return the complete purchase order? If I say yes to this, I'm going to show you what happens. Absolutely nothing. Okay, that must not have had a receipt against it. So if I said yes, it's going to pull in every single item and assume that I'm going to want to return every single item. If I say no to that, then it's going to bring up the list, but then I can put in how many are actually being returned. But once you do that return of goods, let me see if I can find an older one just to pull up. Let's try this one. Nope, it looks like there's not the history in there that I was hoping for. Once you've done that return order, and I apologize, I don't have an example to show you off the top of my head. Once you do that return order, then you are going to go to return order printing, and you're going to print a return order that basically can be used kind of like a packing slip when you're sending those two items back. And then what happens on the PO side is that you ordered 10 and you received 10. If I returned 2, it's going to reopen that PO and show that there's 2 that are still to be received. So that's basically what it does. If it's an inventory item, then in addition to making changes to the purchase order, is that when I return it, it's going to take 2 of those out of stock. So I received in 10, I'm returning 2, so it's literally going to return, it's going to remove 2 from my inventory, and then it's going to think that we're still going to receive those back. So when I do pre-upgrade analysis for clients and they have the PO module, that's one of the questions that I ask, do you do a return order? And I find it's about 50-50. A lot of people say, well, no, we just do an adjustment in our inventory. But if you're really wanting a good audit trail and you're going to get that merchandise back in, your vendor's replacing it, I would really suggest that you do a return of goods. So Jody, I'm going to open it up to see if anyone else has any questions.
I don't see any other questions at this time. I would encourage anybody that has questions to go ahead and type them into the Q&A window so that we can hopefully handle those live online with Pam Scott. If for some reason we can't answer them, we will get back to you offline with those responses after we've done some research.
Okay, thank you. Just a reminder that next month in July, the webinar is going to be on accounts receivable, I believe. So we will be having that webinar in July. And also, in July, you probably have not received an email yet, but you will be receiving one very soon for Save the Date. This year, our end user group meeting is going to be a virtual meeting versus an in-person meeting. And that's going to be held on July the 29th, and it will be that morning. So please watch for that. We plan to have a very similar format as we have for live presentations. We will still have breakout sessions. So we will be doing that via Zoom, and you may have to sign up for your breakout session when you register, but we will have the ability to move you from one session to another if you want to attend multiple breakout sessions. So just kind of keep that in mind and make a little note on your calendar. and we will be getting information out very soon about that. So Jody, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions, correct?
Correct. I don't see any other questions. I did want to let everyone know that I put my email address as well as Pam's email address in the chat window. So if you do have any needs or additional training for purchase order or other modules that you're looking for, please feel free to reach out to one of us. We will figure out if you need Pam and you send it to me, I'll get it to Pam, and vice versa. So we can tag team that and get answers and help as you need it.
Okay, well, I think that concludes our presentation for today. So I want to thank everyone for attending. And the one person that had that question, I will certainly follow up after the session this afternoon and get that answer over to you. So that concludes our presentation for today. So again, thank you for attending, and we're going to go ahead and end the session. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Pam. Bye.